My son told his wife's family I was dead. I found out sitting alone at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night. From a Facebook photo his cousin accidentally tagged him in. The next morning, I called my realtor and sold the building he'd been living in for free for 6 years. That was my way of coming back to life. If that shocks you, keep listening, because by the time I'm done, you'll understand exactly why I did it. And you might even understand why I don't regret a single second of it. I'm Raymond Cole. I'm 67 years old. I worked as a licensed electrician for 38 years in the greater Columbus, Ohio area, starting when I was barely 19 with a borrowed tool belt and calloused hands that didn't know what they were doing yet. I retired at 57 with bad knees, a hearing aid in my left ear from too many years near generators, and a modest but paid-off duplex on Claremont Avenue that I had purchased with cash in 2009. Both units, bought outright. No mortgage, just decades of double shifts and skipped vacations converted into 2 sets of keys. My wife Margaret passed 3 years ago from a stroke. It came fast and it took her fast, which was both the cruelest and the kindest part. She didn't suffer long. I suffered plenty, but that's a different story. We had one son, Connor. He's 34 now. He works in commercial real estate in a downtown office with a view of the Scioto River, and he dresses like a man who has never once carried anything heavier than a briefcase. I used to be proud of that. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I was not a perfect father. I worked too much. I missed some school plays. I wasn't the kind of dad who coached Little League or took fishing trips every summer. But I was there. I showed up for dinner every night I possibly could. I drove him to every job interview when his car broke down. When he got his real estate license, I drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to be at the testing center when he walked out. I stood in the parking lot in January with a cup of bad coffee, and I watched his face when he came through those doors, and that look, that proud, stunned look, that was worth every cold minute. I loved my son the way men like me love. Not with words, with presence, with showing up, and I gave him something that cost me more than I ever told him. The duplex on Claremont Avenue. The lower unit, 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a porch out back with a yard. I told him when he was 29 and just starting out, move in, no rent. Get on your feet. I was living in the upper unit myself. I figured we'd be neighbors, maybe have Sunday dinners. Maybe I'd be around when grandkids eventually came. He moved in with his boxes and his furniture and his laptop, and he said, "Dad, I don't know how to thank you for this." He hugged me in the driveway, and I could feel that he meant it. I held on a little longer than he expected, because Margaret had been gone 8 months by then, and I was still learning how to live inside all that silence. And my son standing in my driveway saying thank you felt like something solid I could hold on to. The deed was still in my name. Always had been. We talked about transferring it, but the timing never felt right. And honestly, I liked knowing that piece of paper had my name on it. Not as control, just as proof that I had built something. That my 38 years of work had left a mark on the world that I could see and touch. That detail becomes important later. I met Brooke for the first time about 1.5 years after Connor moved in. He called me on a Sunday morning, and his voice had that particular energy I recognized. The way it sounded when something good had happened and he was still figuring out how to talk about it. "Dad, I want you to meet someone. Her name is Brooke. She's important to me." I told him to bring her over any Sunday he wanted. I'd fire up the grill. He paused. "Let's do a restaurant instead. Somewhere neutral." I didn't know what needed to be neutral about meeting my son's girlfriend in my own backyard, but I said fine. He picked a place downtown that charged $14 for a glass of iced tea, and I wore my best flannel, the dark green one I keep for occasions, and I showed up 15 minutes early because that's how I was raised. They came in together and she was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Perfectly dressed, hair just so, a smile that arrived about 2 seconds after her eyes. Her eyes did something when she saw me. Not unkind, exactly. More like recalibrating, like she had been told something different and was now adjusting her expectations in real time. I stood up and put out my hand. "Brooke, real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this." She shook it briefly. "Likewise," she said, and sat down. We talked for about 90 minutes. Or rather, Connor and I talked and Brooke listened with that polite, faraway attention of someone sitting through a presentation they already know they won't fund. When I asked her about her family, she mentioned her father ran a private equity firm. When I asked where she grew up, she said Westerville, the nice end. And she said it the way people say things they know carry weight. I told her I'd done electrical work in some of those houses back in the day, and she smiled, that same 2-second delayed smile, and said, "How interesting." On the drive home, I told myself I was being too sensitive, that she was just nervous, that I'd judged people wrong before. But something had shifted in Connor's face during that lunch. When she talked, he watched her like he was checking his own reflection in her expression, like her approval was the mirror he used to see himself. I should have paid more attention to that. The visits after that got shorter. Not all at once. Gradual, the way water erodes stone. It happens so slowly you don't notice until one day you look at the riverbank and realize half of it is gone. Before Brooke, Connor would come up to the upper unit on Sundays and we'd watch football, and I'd make chili, and we'd argue about whether the Browns had a chance this year, which they never did, and it didn't matter, because arguing about it was the point. After Brooke, it was maybe twice a month, then once. Then I'd go 3 weeks without seeing the man who lived directly below me. I started noticing other things. When he came upstairs, he didn't take his shoes off anymore. He used to always kick his shoes off at the door. Now he kept them on, like he was ready to leave at any moment. Like this was a waiting room and not his father's home. He'd sit on the edge of the couch instead of sprawling across it. He kept his phone face up on the cushion beside him and glanced at it every few minutes. One Sunday in February, I made his mother's beef stew from the recipe she kept on a yellow index card in the second kitchen drawer. I'd been saving it for a day when I needed it. I set the table for 2 and called him. "Hey, Dad. We actually have plans with Brooke's parents tonight. Her dad wants to take us to dinner downtown." I stood in my kitchen looking at the pot on the stove. Her parents. Huh. When do I get to meet them? A pause. "We'll figure something out, Dad. It's just, they're a different kind of people. You know, I didn't know. Or I did know, and I didn't want to. A different kind of people," I repeated. "I just mean they have a certain way of doing things. I want it to go right." "What would go wrong, Connor?" He didn't answer directly. He said he had to go. He said he'd call later. He didn't call later. I ate the beef stew alone, and I thought about Margaret, how she always said that when a man starts editing his father out of his stories, the father needs to pay attention. She was usually right about things. I should have listened to her memory a little harder that night. The following months were more of the same. A call here, a text there, nothing real. I got a cold that turned into bronchitis in March, and I was in bed for 4 days, running a fever that scared me more than I let on, because when you're 67 and you live alone, and your body suddenly decides to remind you of your own fragility, fear arrives quietly and sits beside you in the dark. I called Connor on the second day, when the fever hit 102 and I couldn't stand without holding the wall. "Dad, bronchitis isn't an emergency. Have you been taking the Mucinex? Drink fluids. You'll be fine in a couple days." "I know what bronchitis is, son. I just thought you might want to know." "I do know. I'm glad you told me. Listen, we're in the middle of something here. I'll check in with you tomorrow." He didn't check in tomorrow. He texted 3 days later. "Hope you're feeling better. Let me know if you need anything." By then, the fever had broken, and I was sitting in my kitchen eating saltine crackers and realizing with a cold clarity that I had spent 4 days sick and alone below my son's empty apartment, because he had moved into Brooke's place across town 6 weeks earlier without making a big thing of it, and I had said nothing because I didn't want to seem like the kind of father who keeps score. My neighbor Walt, who lives 2 houses down and retired from the post office the same year I retired from electrical, he's the one who checked on me. He came over with soup his wife Darlene made, and he sat in my kitchen and he said, "You look like hell, Ray." And I almost laughed because hearing someone say something honest felt like fresh air. "I'm all right," I said. "You called Connor?" "He's busy." Walt looked at me for a long moment. "He's known me for 14 years. He knows when I'm protecting someone." "Ray," he said, And then he just shook his head and didn't finish the sentence. And sometimes that's the most honest thing a person can say. That was in March. By June, I had probably seen my son 4 times in person, all of them brief, all of them with that same feeling of him keeping one foot out the door. I tried not to count the days between calls. I did count them. I kept a note in my phone, just numbers in a list, because I needed to know I wasn't exaggerating. 10 days, 14, 18, 22. My cousin Linda's daughter posted a photo on Facebook on a Thursday evening in October. I almost missed it. I only saw it because my cousin Linda commented on it, and her name came across my feed, and I clicked out of something close to boredom. The harmless, idle scrolling of a man sitting alone after dinner. The photo was from a party. A nice one. There were long tables with white linen and candles, and arrangements of flowers in tall vases. There were people in formal clothes, laughing, toasting, arranged in the comfortable poses of people who belong exactly where they are. And there in the center of one photo, with his arm around Brooke and her parents on either side and a smile on his face I hadn't seen in years, was my son Connor. Linda's daughter had tagged him. "Congratulations to the happy couple," the caption read, and below it, already accumulating comments, congratulations and heart emojis and someone saying the most beautiful engagement party. I sat very still. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate. The chicken I'd been eating was suddenly just something in front of me that didn't matter. I looked at the photo again. I counted the people at the visible tables. 40, maybe 50 guests. I looked at the flowers, the candles, the catering trays in the background. I looked at Brooke's mother in a pale gold dress, laughing at something. I looked at Brooke's father with his arm around Connor like he was his own, like he had always been his own. My son had gotten engaged. He had thrown a party for 50 people. He had not told me. I sat at that table for a long time. Outside, a car went by. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove showed 7:14 inches the evening. I am not a man who cries easily. I didn't cry when I watched those photos. My eyes burned. My throat closed around something. But the tears didn't come. And after a while I understood why. Because this wasn't surprise. This was confirmation. This was the final piece clicking into place in a puzzle I had been pretending not to see for 18 months. I went to bed that night, and I did not sleep. And sometime around 2 inches the morning, I started to think about a conversation I'd had with Walt 3 weeks earlier. Walt had said, "You know what I heard from Darlene's sister? She ran into Connor and that girlfriend of his at the farmer's market. And when Darlene's sister asked about his family, the girlfriend said something like, 'Oh, his parents are gone.' I had told Walt that Darlene's sister must have misheard. That Connor probably meant his mother was gone. That he wouldn't say something like that. Lying in the dark at 2 inches the morning, I stopped making excuses. I called him the next morning at 9. He answered on the second ring, which told me he hadn't thought to prepare himself. "Hey, Dad. What's up?" "Congratulations," I said. A pause. Long enough to confirm everything. "On what?" "On your engagement, Connor. I saw the photos from the party last night. Linda's daughter tagged you." The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of someone calculating how much they can deny against how much you already know. "Dad, how many people were there?" "Dad, let me explain." "How many people at that party, Connor?" "About 60. 60 people. Your father is not one of them. It was Brooke's family's party. Her parents organized it. The guest list was theirs. I let that sit for a moment. Did you ask them to put me on it?" Silence. "Did you ask for one seat for your father?" "It's complicated, Dad. Her family has a certain—" "Her father called you son in that photo." More silence. And then quietly, "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth. Did you tell them I was gone? Did you tell Brooke's family that I was dead?" The silence this time was the longest of all. And I knew. I knew before he said a word. I knew from the way his breathing changed. That slight shift that sounds like a man deciding how much of himself to hand over. "I didn't say dead," he finally said. I let them assume. When Brooke first mentioned meeting my family, I said my mom passed. And she said she was sorry. And her mom said, "Oh, so you're on your own." And I didn't correct it. You let them think I was dead. I didn't want to get into the whole thing. The whole thing. I could hear my voice going flat. Not angry. Flat. The way a room goes quiet before a storm. What whole thing, Connor? What is so complicated about having a father? He exhaled. Dad, you have to understand who these people are. Her father went to Wharton. Her family has a foundation. They go to Aspen. When Brooke first brought me around, I had to prove myself. And I was already starting from behind, you know? And having to explain that my dad is a retired electrician from the East Side who lives above a rental unit. You were ashamed of me. That's not. Yes, it is, Connor. Say it. You were ashamed of me. I just didn't want you to feel out of place. You let them think I was dead so you wouldn't have to feel embarrassed. He didn't answer. That silence was its own answer. The loudest one he'd given me. I told him I had to go. He started saying something about getting together soon, about sitting down and working this out. I said, yes, fine, we'll talk. And I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I looked at my hands. These hands. 38 years of electrical work. Burn scars on 2 knuckles from a panel that arced when I was 31. A finger that bends slightly wrong from a conduit accident in 1999. A permanent darkness in the skin around the nails that no amount of scrubbing ever completely removes. I looked at these hands and I thought about Brooke's family and their foundation and their trips to Aspen, and I thought about my son looking at me across a restaurant table and deciding, quietly, over the following months, that I was a liability. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Clean and cold and specific. Not at Brooke. Not at her family. At my son, who had a choice every single day, who could have said my dad is a retired electrician and he worked himself down to the bone to give me everything I have, and I'm proud of him, and instead chose silence. Instead let them assume. Instead showed up to a party for 60 people and raised a glass and smiled for photos while his father was eating chicken alone in an empty apartment 30 minutes away. I walked to my bedroom. I went to the closet, the top shelf, behind the winter blankets. I pulled out a manila folder I hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside was a set of documents including the property deed for 1147 Claremont Avenue. Owner, Raymond Walter Cole. I read my own name twice. Then I put the folder under my arm, and I went downstairs to my front porch, and I sat in the morning sun, and I thought about what I was going to do. The thing about being invisible is that eventually, if you're invisible long enough, people forget you can still act. They start treating you like a piece of furniture, something that exists in the background, that you arrange your life around without ever really seeing. My son had been doing this to me for 2 years without realizing that invisible men still hold deeds. I didn't make the decision that day out of rage. I want to be clear about that. I made it out of something that took a long time to arrive, something that my wife used to call coming to yourself. The moment when you stop apologizing for existing and start remembering who you actually are. I called Walt that afternoon. I told him what had happened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You know my brother-in-law is a property broker, right?" I said I remembered that. He's been looking for duplexes on that side of town for a client. Cash buyer. She wants to be close to her grandkids at OSU. I said, "Call him for me." Walt's brother-in-law, a man named Dennis, came by the next morning, walked both units, checked the square footage, looked at the condition. He was professional and efficient, and he said what I already knew. The building was in good shape, good location, move-in ready. He gave me a number. It was fair. I didn't negotiate. "You sure about this, Ray?" he asked at the door. "I'm sure. What about the tenant downstairs? Connor, right? Your son? He's not on a lease," I said. "He never was." Dennis nodded slowly. "I'll draw up the paperwork. Buyer can close in 10 days. I signed 3 days later. Simple, clean, done. The property that had been mine since 2009, paid for with money I earned before my son was thinking about Aspen or Wharton or what kind of father fit the life he wanted to build. Signed over with a steady hand. I called Connor that evening. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Dad." I was actually going to call you. I think we should have dinner this week, try to. I need you to be out of the lower unit by the 15th, I said. 2 weeks from today. Silence. What? I sold the building, Connor. It closes on the 15th. The new owner will want possession. You! His voice cracked. You sold the building. I did. Dad. I live there. That's my home. It was my property. Always was. Your name was never on the deed. Never on any paperwork. I gave you the keys, and I said stay as long as you need. But the building was mine. You can't, Dad. Brooke and I just got engaged. We're planning a wedding. We were going to stay there until we figured out our next step. You can't just... You can stay at Brooke's parents' place, I said quietly. I hear they're very welcoming. They have room for family. Another silence. And then, I heard something shift in his voice. From shock into something harder. Is this about the party? Is this seriously about the party? It's about 2 years, Connor. The party is just the part I finally couldn't pretend away. I made a mistake. I should have told you. I know that. But you're going to make me homeless over it? You're 34 years old with a good salary and a fiancé whose father went to Wharton, I said. You're not going to be homeless. You're going to pay rent like every other adult. You're going to feel, for the first time, what it's like to have something you can't take for granted. Dad, please. His voice broke, the anger cracking, fear showing underneath. We can fix this. I'll talk to Brooke. We'll have dinner. You can meet her family. We'll explain. I don't want to be explained, I said. I don't want to be introduced as the father you were hiding. I don't want a seat at a table where I've already been eulogized. I paused. 2 weeks, Connor. Take care of yourself. I turned the phone over on the table, sat with the quiet for a while. It was Walt who had said it to me once, years ago when his own brother had cut him out of the family for a period. Over something small that grew into something large the way small things do. Walt had said, "The worst part isn't when they hurt you. The worst part is when you realize you taught them it was okay. Every time you didn't say anything, you were teaching them that you didn't matter." I had taught my son, over many years, that I would absorb anything, that I would show up with soup and call on his birthday and leave the porch light on and never, ever make it difficult to ignore me. I made it easy. And he learned that easy was the same as free. What I did with that building wasn't revenge. Not exactly. Revenge would have required me to feel something violent, something hot. What I felt was more like correction. I was correcting something I had let go wrong for too long. Connor drove over 2 days later. He didn't call first. He knocked on my door at 8 inches the morning, with his eyes red and his hair undone, and the look of a man who had driven through the night of his own decisions and arrived somewhere he wasn't prepared for. I opened the door and stepped back to let him in. He stood in my living room. He didn't sit down. He looked around the room like he was seeing it differently, like the familiar furniture had rearranged itself into something strange, which maybe it had. "How could you do this?" he said. It wasn't really a question. I sat in my armchair. "Sit down, Connor." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to explain to me how you could sell my home without even warning me, without giving me a chance to." "To what? To fix it? The way you fixed things when you found out I was sick and alone for 4 days? The way you fixed things when I spent Thanksgiving by myself because you were with her family? The way you fixed the 60-person engagement party that somehow didn't have room for your father?" He went quiet. His jaw worked. "Connor, I'm not asking you to justify any of that anymore. I'm done asking. I'm just telling you that I watched it happen for 2 years, and every time I gave you the benefit of the doubt, and every time I told myself you were busy, you were figuring things out, you were in a new relationship and finding your footing, and I swallowed my own hurt because I loved you and I wanted you to be happy. I am. Let me finish." My voice was steady. I surprised myself. "When you let that woman's family believe I was dead, Connor, that was not a misunderstanding. That was not a moment of forgetfulness. That was a decision you made and maintained for months. You looked at who I was, my hands and my work and my life, and you decided it didn't fit the story you wanted to tell about yourself. And you erased me." His eyes filled. He blinked hard. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know how bad that is. I know. I know you know. But knowing isn't the same as doing differently. I will do differently. I'll tell Brooke everything. I'll tell her parents. We'll start over. Just please, don't do this. That building, Dad, it meant something. It meant 38 years of my life converted into walls, I said. I carried bricks and ran wires and climbed into attics in July, heat and crawl spaces in January, cold. And I did it because I wanted to give you something solid. Something you could always come back to. I looked at him steadily. But you decided the thing you needed most was to get away from where you came from. You decided your father was the one thing standing between you and the life you wanted, and you started acting like it. That's not true. Then tell me, when was the last time you introduced me to someone with pride? When was the last time you told anyone, that's my dad. He built something from nothing. He gave me everything I have. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because we both already knew. I stood up, went to the kitchen, poured myself a coffee, stood by the counter. When I came back to the doorway, he was still there, smaller somehow, the anger gone out of him, and just the grief underneath. I'm not trying to destroy you, I said. I'm not trying to hurt Brooke or ruin your engagement. I hope you're happy. I genuinely do. But that building was mine. I built it. I kept it. And giving it to you while you were treating me like I'd already died was something I was not willing to keep doing. Where does that leave us? He asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought about that. Honest question deserved an honest answer. I don't know yet. That part is up to you. Not because I'm putting conditions on loving you. I'm your father. That doesn't change. But I spent 2 years being invisible in your life. And I'm not doing that anymore. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to be a real one. I'm going to be at your wedding. I'm going to meet Brooke's parents as myself, Raymond Cole, retired electrician, your father, not as a secret and not as an afterthought. If that works for you, then we figure out the rest. If it doesn't work for you, that's a choice you can make. But I won't beg you to include me. He stood there for a long moment, tears running down his face now, not fighting them anymore. My son, 34 years old, standing in my living room looking young in a way he hadn't looked in years. I was so afraid, he finally said, that they'd look at you and look at me and think I didn't belong, that they'd see where I came from and decide I wasn't right for her. And what do you think now? He shook his head slowly. I think I was wrong about what belonging means. I walked over to him. I put my hand on his shoulder, the way I used to when he was small and scared of something, a storm coming or a test the next day. He flinched slightly, surprised, and then he leaned into it. Being ashamed of where you came from, I said quietly, is the same as being ashamed of every hand that built the floor you're standing on. You don't have to carry that. He didn't say anything. He just stood there under my hand, breathing. We didn't fix everything that morning. That's not how it works. He left an hour later and I watched him walk down the front path and get into his car, and I didn't know exactly what would happen next. Whether he would tell Brooke the truth, whether her family would care, whether my son and I would find our way back to something real. But I knew this. I would not be invisible again. Not in my own story. Not in the story of my son's life. Whatever happened from here, I would take up the space I had earned. I went back inside. I made a second cup of coffee. I sat in my armchair by the window, and I watched the Claremont Avenue neighborhood do what it always does in the morning. People walking dogs, a school bus stopping at the corner, the light changing on the leaves now that October had arrived in full. Walt came by around noon with his wife's leftover cornbread, and he sat across from me, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important and everything real, the way old friends do. The way men who have showed up for each other for 14 years do without making a ceremony of it. He asked me how I felt. I thought about it honestly. Like myself, I said. For the first time in a while, he nodded like that was the right answer. And it was. If you've been made to feel like a burden in your own family's story, if you know what it means to be slowly edited out of a life you helped build, then you understand why I did what I did. Not for revenge, not to win, but because there comes a point where accepting invisibility is the same as agreeing to disappear. And I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. And if this story reached something in you, something real, hit like and subscribe to Father's Still Revenge. Because every week, we tell the stories of people who decided they were done being invisible. Stories that might be yours. Stories that remind us that dignity is not something anyone else gets to give you. You take it back yourself. And it is always, always worth it.